Jennifer Hamukwaya had built her career like a fortress. Brick by brick, title by title, she had climbed the neat, well-lit corridors of respectability. A chartered accountant trained under Deloitte with degrees from Namibia and South Africa, her résumé spoke of order, precision, and an almost stubborn adherence to structure. But the fortress may have had cracks invisible to the naked eye. This is the story of her alleged involvement in the syndicate that allegedly defrauded the National Petroleum Corporation of Namibia of about 480 million Namibian dollars.
The morning of Jennifer Hamakwaya's arrest began in a meeting room at the Namibia Qualifications Authority in July of 2025. She was mid-discussion, a page of notes in front of her, when her phone rang. On the other end, news. Cornelius Cedric Willemse had been arrested. She called former Namcor Managing Director Emmanuel Malunga to confirm. At first, he said no. Then, 30 minutes later, his voice returned to her through the line. Yes, Willemse had been taken. She sat there, back in her chair, the air in the room suddenly heavy. Malunga's voice over the phone was cautious, almost strained. There were warrants for ex-Namcor executives, and she could be one of them to be arrested next. She pulled her supervisor aside, into a smaller room, to confess what she had heard. But before she could finish, a secretary arrived with a message that cut the air like a knife. The police were here, looking for her. The walk to the car park was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Beside her, the managing director of the NQA and her supervisor kept pace. In the open daylight, Inspector Anna of the Namibian police introduced herself and told her she was under arrest for corruption, fraud, and money laundering linked to Namcor. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought of the 3 children she had left at home. A pair of boys aged 10 and 13, and a 5-year-old girl, and the nanny who had promised to watch over them. The accusations painted a picture far removed from the polished professional profile. The state alleged that she had received hundreds of thousands into an account belonging to Panduleni Farming CC, a business tied to her husband. The timing, investigators said, was no coincidence. Days after she approved a purchase order for Erongo Petroleum, a company already implicated in credit fraud, $500,000 Namibian appeared in Panduleni Farming's account. Weeks later, $643,000 went toward their mortgage. The court heard of payments from businessman Peter Elindi, millions flowing from his company Enecon to both Hamukwaya and Willemse, allegedly to secure the purchase of 9 service stations by Namcor. More millions, the state claimed, passed under the table to keep fuel flowing to Enecon and Erongo Petroleum without following procedure. Between August 2022 and May 2023, they said, fuel worth 277 million Namibian dollars had moved under these arrangements. Hamakwaya's defense was precise, almost surgical in its delivery. She sat upright, eyes steady, answering each question as if the words had been measured beforehand. She told the court that her sole motivation had been to safeguard Namcor's financial position, that her actions were deliberate steps taken to ensure the company's interests were protected. In her account, there was no hint of personal gain, no desire to enrich herself at the expense of the organization she had served for years. She explained that her access to Enecon's bank account was not part of some covert arrangement, months in the making, as the state alleged, but a procedural necessity that came into play only when the supply agreement between Namcor and Enecon became effective in March 2022. On that very day, she became a joint signatory, not before, not after. Her reasoning was clear. The Ministry of Defence was to pay Enecon for fuel under the agreement, and those funds had to be transferred without delay or diversion to Namcor. Her presence on the account was, in her telling, another layer of control, a fail-safe to make sure every cent went where it was intended. It was a defense that drew on her professional identity. She painted herself as the vigilant custodian of corporate money, someone whose duty was defined by internal controls and financial discipline. She spoke of systems, checks, and authorizations, those invisible levers that keep large transactions from slipping into shadow. Every action, she insisted, had been rooted in procedure. But when former managing director Emmanuel Malunga took the stand, his account pushed the responsibility elsewhere. He claimed it was never his role to watch over those funds directly. That duty, he said, belonged to his subordinates, the executives under him who were tasked with overseeing the day-to-day management of accounts and client transactions. He implied that Hamakwaya's role, while important, existed within a wider framework where she was one of several hands meant to keep the machine running. The state, however, was not content to leave it at that. They pressed the point almost to the edge of repetition, asking the question that had been hovering over the proceedings like a shadow. If these safeguards were in place, if executives and subordinates were both doing their jobs, why had Namcor continued to supply fuel to Enercon when the company's debt had already crossed the $100 million mark? How could such a massive liability exist when the credit limit was a mere $15 million? The prosecution suggested that what Hamukwaya described as protection of Namcor's interests looked very different when seen in light of the company's credit policies. Continuing to supply fuel under those circumstances, they argued, was not protection at all. It was exposure, a risk that defied logic unless there were motives beyond standard business practice. The decision to extend supply despite the arrears, they hinted, could only be explained by relationships and understandings that were not documented in official agreements. In the courtroom, that gap between her version and theirs was not just a matter of interpretation, it was the battleground. Hamakwaya's defense relied on the idea that her role began at a single, fixed point in time, tied to the signing of the agreement, and that everything she did thereafter was anchored in process. The state's narrative was broader, stretching the timeline backwards, pulling in documents and resolutions that suggested her access to the Enercon account predated the agreement by months. To them, this was not a coincidence, but a sign that she had been positioned long before the deal was formalized, ready to act in ways that would later benefit certain parties. Each side spoke as if the truth was self-evident, but in the silence after the exchanges, the tension lingered. Whether Hamakwaya's actions were the work of a cautious guardian of Namcor's funds, or the calculated moves of someone already entangled in a web of obligations that had nothing to do with protecting the company's interests. A forensic audit by PwC Namibia unearthed irregularities, credit guarantees cancelled, limits ignored, payments routed through unexpected channels. Investigators claimed Hamukwaya had been given access to Enercon's bank account 5 months before any agreement with Namcor even existed. There was no record of Namcor authorizing her role. When asked why she cancelled a $5 million credit guarantee from Enercon in November 2021, she said there was something wrong with it. Without the guarantee, Enercon's credit limit dropped to zero, meaning only cash sales were possible. But that policy, like so many others in this case, dissolved in practice. To understand why this matters, it helps to unpack the mechanics behind a cash-only policy. In its simplest form, a cash-only policy means that a client must pay upfront before receiving goods or services. It exists to eliminate the risk of non-payment. In theory, it is a strict safeguard. The company never extends credit, never allows debt to accumulate, and never puts itself in a position where it is chasing after overdue invoices. But in practice, this kind of policy is only as strong as the people enforcing it. If employees quietly make exceptions, delivering fuel on the promise of future payment, bending rules for preferred clients, the cash-only safeguard collapses. Those exceptions can be exploited by insiders to funnel large amounts of goods or fuel out of the company without the immediate exchange of money, leaving the business exposed to massive losses if the client later defaults. The credit guarantee is the opposite side of the same coin. A credit guarantee is essentially a financial safety net, often provided by a bank or other financial institution, which promises to cover a client's debt up to a certain limit if they fail to pay. For the supplier, it is a form of insurance. You can extend credit to the client, confident that even if they cannot or will not pay, the guarantor will make you whole. Cancelling a credit guarantee removes that safety net entirely. If you still allow the client to buy on credit after cancelling the guarantee, you have stripped away the very protection meant to absorb the risk. Worse still, cancelling a valid guarantee under questionable circumstances can be a deliberate tactic, clearing the way for transactions to take place in a more opaque manner without the oversight that a formal guarantee requires. It can also make it easier for a syndicate to move goods or funds without triggering alarms in the company's credit control system. In short, a cash-only policy that is not enforced is no policy at all, and a cancelled credit guarantee that is not replaced is a gaping hole in financial controls. In the wrong hands, both become tools, not of risk management, but of manipulation, allowing the deliberate bypassing of systems designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of losses alleged in this case. So, once the $5 million credit guarantee vanished, the rules were clear. Enecon's credit limit stood at 0. In that world, the game was supposed to be simple. No cash, no fuel. But the paperwork and the reality began to drift apart. Tankers rolled, pumps flowed, and fuel worth hundreds of millions left Namcor's control without the bank balance to justify it. In theory, a cash-only policy is a padlock. But here, the padlock wasn't broken, it was opened, willingly. The state says Enecon and Erongo Petroleum received the keys, bypassing the barrier entirely. What they got was not a trickle. Between August 2022 and May 2023, the value of the fuel supplied without upfront payment swelled to $277 million Namibian dollars. And in return, the prosecution points to payments, $500,000 here, $600,000 there, alleged to have landed in accounts tied to Namcor executives or their families. The mathematics of it borders on absurd. Vast rivers of fuel, worth more than $250 million, traded away for what, in corporate terms, was pocket change. This is the kind of equation that draws forensic auditors like moths to a flame. Enormous assets flowing out, minimal consideration flowing in, and a trail of approvals that defy the stated policies of the organisation. It is also where the story tilts from negligence into something more calculated. If the state's theory holds, this was not a mistake. It was an arrangement. The entities receiving the fuel walked away with the kind of margin you cannot achieve in any honest market. The gap between the bribe and the benefit so wide it swallows reason whole. In the shadows of boardrooms and loading bays, this gap is the beating heart of the case. A deal where the house did not just lose, it handed over the keys, the safe, and the vault, asking for little more in return than a token to mark the occasion. That imbalance, that sheer disproportion between what was given and what was received, is what makes the allegations so staggering. It is, in its own way, the most damning number of them all. From December 2021 to March 2022, Enecon took on $73 million of debt from another company, EcoFuel Investment CC, owned by Victor Malema. By March, they were signing an exclusive supply deal with Namcor without a valid guarantee in place. The collateral? Government purchase orders from the Ministry of Defence. By May, Namcor was already planning to acquire Enecon's fuel infrastructure for over $53 million. The board was never consulted. The investigation widened. The Anti-Corruption Commission said this was no isolated breach. It was a network. Alongside Hamukwaya and Willems were names like Olivia Grace Dunayski, the Elindi brothers, and retired Army Brigadier James Awala. Victor Malema, now in Angola, was said to be on the run. The figure the state attached to the scheme was staggering: 480 million Namibian dollars lost through improper fuel supply, manipulated credit policies, and covert payments. The transactions were wrapped in layers of corporate agreements, each one giving the illusion of legitimacy until pulled apart in court. Her lawyer accused the Anti-Corruption Commission of being used by Namcor to persecute her. He argued that the criminal charges were not being pursued in isolation, but were coloured by other disputes, pointing to ongoing High Court litigation between Namcor and the accused as proof. The ACC and yourself have fallen into a trap of Namcor to be used to persecute and victimise my client, he told the magistrate. The irony is stark. Less than 2 years earlier, in June 2023, Hamukwaya's relationship with Namcor had ended in a completely different courtroom battle. After the board refused to renew her 5-year contract, she sued the state oil company, eventually walking away with a High Court-approved settlement worth 1.6 million Namibian dollars, 9 months of her executive salary. At that point, her tenure as executive of finance and administration had formally closed, her office vacated, her departure sealed by legal agreement. Yet now, in 2025, the company that had once paid her to leave stands at the centre of 2 other conflicts involving her. One is the civil litigation still grinding its way through the High Court. The other is this criminal case, in which prosecutors allege she was part of a syndicate that used Namcor's own resources to enrich themselves and their associates. The juxtaposition is hard to ignore. In one courtroom, Namcor was the counterparty to a settlement. In another, it is entangled with her in ongoing civil proceedings, and here, in the criminal dock, it appears as both victim and witness to alleged crimes involving hundreds of millions of dollars. The narrative has yet to resolve. The bail hearings drag on. Witnesses are cross-examined, their stories sharpened by lawyers on both sides. Outside, the numbers hang in the air like a shadow. 277 million in fuel, 480 million in alleged fraud, 643,000 toward a mortgage, 500,000 in unexplained transfers. And at the centre of it, Jennifer Hamukwaya, accountant, executive, wife, mother, stands in the dock, her future hanging on the outcome of a case that has already consumed reputations, careers, and untold sums of money. In the quiet moments between court sessions, one question lingers. Was she a loyal steward of Namcor's finances, caught in the crossfire of corporate power struggles? Or an architect in one of Namibia's most audacious corporate crimes?
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It really helps more people discover these stories. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the biggest crime and corruption cases in Namibia, South Africa, and beyond. What do you think about the allegations against Jennifer Hamukwaya? Is this a case of corporate power plays or calculated corruption? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.